All right, welcome back. We are going to be focusing on Esther and a couple of those issues that I brought up last time, especially overturning and hiding and revealing. So I hope you've had some time to kind of think about some of those issues and pick out some perhaps interesting ways that you found those dynamics working in the text. I just want to say those are for many scholars two of the main themes in the book of Esther. Those have to do in a way with Purim, the festival that is explained at the end of Esther, that probably started as a Babylonian game, like a Babylonian game of chance. So there's a lot of themes of chance in Esther, in this game of really kind of like rolling dice. The pur means like the lots, or the things that you'd roll as a game of chance. And there's a lot of chance things that happen in Esther. Of course, Christians and Jews have often read this to be kind of signs of God's work in the text. But also it's really interesting to notice that God is pretty much absent in the version of Esther that we have. One other background piece of material here is that early Christians and Jews noticed this absence, this kind of glaring absence of God in the book of Esther, and so wrote God back into the script. So in your HarperCollins Study Bible, there are additions to Esther. They are found in the Greek text of Esther, and they were added by pious scribes who noticed that God is missing in Esther, that none of the characters pray or do anything particularly religious. So they wrote these long, beautiful, theologically rich prayers that are stuck throughout the book. So you can read that in the additions to Esther in the HarperCollins Study Bible. If you're looking for a page, you turn past the Old Testament but before the New Testament in what we would call the Apocrypha, with books like Tobit and so on. Here's Tobit, Wisdom of Sirach here, the Maccabees, Prayer of Azariah. Baruch is another one of these texts in the Apocrypha, Second Esdras, and so on. And then we have Third, Fourth Maccabees. Where is Esther here? I'm gonna split cut this to where I know where the additions to Esther are. So Malachi. So the additions to Esther start on page 1333 of your HarperCollins Study Bible. It's Esther according to the Greek chapters, the additional chapters of Esther. There we go. The additional chapters of Esther. Just to say that this is kind of a predominant theme in Esther, but also might have to do with the somewhat secular theme of Purim. It is I don't know if you've ever heard of Purim, but it's kind of a crazy festival in the Jewish calendar. It's almost like Jewish Halloween. People dress up in costumes. You're supposed to dress in costumes that are kind of outlandish or crazy. There's a lot of cross-dressing that happens, breaking of kind of gender norms and boundaries, and the performative acting out of different social roles that you would be prevented in normal kind of daily life from undertaking, at least without, especially in the ancient culture, some kind of shaming associated with kind of crossing some of those boundaries. But in Purim, anything goes. It's kind of a carnival day, right? You're supposed to act kind of crazy and there's even a Talmudic a rabbi says if you show up to the Purim festival and while the story is being read, people read the story of Esther at a Purim festival. When they're reading the story of Esther, if you can tell the characters apart from one another, you haven't had enough to drink. That's literally in the Talmud. That's what Jewish rabbis would say. Now, they're almost always saying, like, refrain from drinking too much, etc. But this is the one day a year you were supposed to really let loose, they say. When people read the stories aloud, you're supposed to kind of cheer for the good guys like Mordecai and Esther. You're supposed to boo for the bad characters like Haman. And by the end of the night, everyone is failing to recognize who's who. So it's an over-the-top day, a day of kind of overturning and a day of revealing. Maybe on those occasions you can kind of reveal more about who you really are than you typically can with typical social distinctions and mores. So all to say, this is kind of the background for this book. But one other thing is that Esther, pretty clearly from the beginning, is satire. Satire, right? So the genre of Esther is a court story where a Jew is living in the court of a foreign king. But also we could say satire is an element of this too, because it's kind of making fun or poking fun. Daniel 1-6 does this too, poking fun of the foreign king. But it does it in pretty clear ways. So from the very beginning of Esther, so Esther chapter 1, verse 1, this happened in the days of Ahasuerus, the same Ahasuerus who ruled over 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia. This is a joke. It's like saying there's 300 states in the United States. We all know there's 50 states in the United States. There are different numbers of satrapies, or I guess you can think of it as kind of states within the Persian Empire, but it was always around 20. So 120 is a crazy exaggeration, and that's the point. It's supposed to be an over-the-top story. It's an exaggeration. From the very first sentence, they're telling you that it's going to be an over-the-top story. It's making fun of things. And then, of course, in those days when King Ahasuerus, verse 2, sat in his royal throne in the citadel of Susa, this is one of the capitals of the Persian Empire, in the third year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all his officials and ministers. The army of Persia and Media and the nobles and the governors and the provinces were present while he displayed the great wealth of his kingdom and the splendor and pomp of his majesties for many days, 180 days in all. So he has a 180-day party for all of his royal officers. That's supposed to be funny, right? There's kind of a cultural trope that the Greeks, if you ever read Herodotus, a Greek historian, that they used to kind of make fun of the Persians with whom the Greeks often fought. But also the Jews here are writing stories that are poking fun of Persians for like over feasting, like just bizarrely heroic bouts of feasting and drinking. So 180-day drinking festival. And so then verse 5 makes this even more funny, or it's trying to poke fun. When these days were completed, the king gave for all the people a present in the citadel of Susa, both great and small, a banquet lasting 7 days. So they got through a 180-day party, and to like thank everyone for the 180-day party, the king threw a 7-day party. So again, it's supposed to be really funny. Now this leads into what is comical, but also kind of sadly comical, or there's a kind of a use and abuse of someone that happens here in chapter 1, and that is Queen Vashti. One thing to point out here is that Queen Vashti is not a name of a queen that was ever associated with the king in Persia, any king of Persia, in any annal, the official historical annals. This tells us something. I mean, Jews working the court of a foreign king in Persia knew that Queen Vashti didn't exist. So why invent a character that everyone would know in this position was a fictional character? Well, maybe it's the same reason that you'd say there's 120 states in the Persian Empire. It's supposed to be over the top. It's letting you know that this story is not about history. And in fact, history as a genre is made fun of in the book of Esther. Did you notice that when the king wants to sleep at night, he gets someone to come and read him the annals? And that's also how he discovers or like remembers that Mordecai is the one who helped him in his time of need. But this is the joke is that history is so boring that it's what you read when you go to sleep. Instead, we want these stories that might not be history, but they're fun. But also they're instructive. It's trying to tell us something about the world. So anyway, all that is kind of background to this. I hope you've engaged either the question of overturning or hiding and revealing. Just to start with kind of overturning some of the things that I notice in the book of Esther that have to do with this. And here's a little image of Purim, this kind of party. Here's some dudes getting drunk at Purim. This is not. This is what happens at Purim, and feasting and general partying. So. Esther's identity is tied up with these issues of overturning and of hiding and revealing, and Esther herself is trying the whole book, it seems, to maintain, define, and protect her identity, and in a way act it out, enact it, create it by being her, so performing her identity. And we can see that there's a lot of issues that cut through all this overturning and hiding and revealing that have to do with power and gender and ethnicity. It says power there, sorry, but here's a really beautiful mosaic of the king offering to Esther the scepter, which of course is the kind of pinnacle, the climax of the story, whether or not it's going to happen. Okay, so let me move my big head here. This, by the way, this image here that you can see on the screen, this is from Dura Europos. It's in modern-day Syria. It was kind of the edge of the Roman Empire at one point in time. This is one of the earliest synagogues that we know of, and it's actually the site of the earliest church building that we know of. It was destroyed in about 250 A.D., and then it was destroyed in such a way that it preserved the art on the walls of the synagogue, which is a surprise because Jews are associated later in history with not having art in their synagogues. but we can see that Jews did have art in at least some synagogues very early on. And so this is from about 250 AD, and this is an image of this right here is Haman taking Mordecai on the horse, and everybody applauding and so on and cheering. And here is the king, and here's Esther kind of sitting in the background behind the king, but also higher than her. Like her head kind of goes taller than the king. And in ancient art like this, the person who was highest up was the most in the image, was often, not always, but often, especially when they're seated like royalty, was the most revered. It's called a hierarchy of scale. The biggest person, is the best. And so here Esther is kind of taller than the king, which is supposed to be a little subtle jab at him. But I'm going to cover up Haman over here. Sorry, with my face. But these issues of overturning and reversal, overturning, things being turned over. Just notice some of the things that happen, like even in chapter 1. Noticed the overturning that happens with Vashti, right? Vashti overturns the king's royal authority. She refuses to show up and wear perhaps only her royal crown, right, to show her beauty off. And she refuses this in verse 12 of chapter 1. Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command, conveyed by the eunuchs, and at this the king was enraged and his anger burned within him. So she's overturning the king's authority, and this is like, terrifying to the men, right? This is horrific, right? And so then verse 13, the king consulted these wise men, the sages who knew all the laws. And there's this joke, a kind of ongoing joke in Jewish culture that the Persians write laws that they can't overturn. This also shows up in Daniel 1-6. Kind of a strange thing, but in any event, the idea is that like the Persians held so fast to their laws that their laws could even like hold up their king. The Persians are also fascinated with writing, and so writing the laws out kind of gave power to it. That's a big background here about the rise of written authority. You can see the same thing happen with like Ezra and Nehemiah, right? Where Ezra shows up with this big book, and now all of a sudden that has all the authority because the Persians, in a way, have invested writing with authority. Verse 15, according to the law, what is to be done to Queen Vashti because she has not performed the command of King Ahasuerus, right? So she broke the king's rules, right? She overturned the king's authority. And then verse 16, the Memucan, this one official, says, not only is the Queen Vashti done wrong to the king, but also to all the officials and all the people, right? And this is like everyone should be scared of this, all men, right? Verse 17, for this deed of the queen shall be made known to all women, causing them to look with contempt on their husbands. So there's an overturning of gender authority and gender kind of expectations that is happening here in the text, or at least presumed, right? That's going to happen. This is going to be a signal to all women to kind of rise up and look with contempt on their husbands. And because Queen Vashti did it, right? So she's setting the good example. So there's an overturning of gender authority here. And then the king says, of course, Vashti is never again to come before King Ahasuerus. Let the king give her royal position to another who's better than she. So she gets exiled and she goes away, and she's never heard from in the story again. There is a bit of overturning there too, because it's supposed to be like he's cast her out, right? But also there's a reversal there, because that's what Vashti wanted, right? Was not to show up and stand in front of the king. So she actually ends up getting what she wants in the end. So that's I think something to think about there. It's one example of this kind of overturning, right? This kind of authority that someone's trying to enact their authority, but also you can see this deep anxiety underneath it that they actually don't have the authority that they're supposed to have, right? The women actually have authority to either look with contempt on their husbands or not, and you can't force them to do that. You can't force Queen Vashti to come and show herself off in this kind of beauty pageant thing. So in any event, this is an interesting example of this theme here. So other things, I mean, there's tons of other examples that I'm sure you brought up. But the issue with Esther kind of overturning the king's command and that Haman set up, right? That issue of overturning the kind of the expectation that the king was going to be really upset with her for asking for this. The overturning of Haman's plot as a whole, that he wanted to kill all the Jews in the kingdom, and that this gets overturned. There's also the kind of overturning or reversal of the 10,000 pieces of silver in the plot. Purim itself is a rolling or an overturning of dice that leads to some surprising consequences, right? So this, you can see the kind of the themes of Purim, the festival, are showing up in this literature itself. Also, you can see kind of who's having parties at the beginning and who's having parties at the end of the story. There's an overturning there. There's an overturning of Mordecai's, reversal of Mordecai's debased state and Haman's exalted state, where Haman then is debased and Mordecai is exalted. There's the overturning or reversal of an assassination plot on the king. So anyway, there's a whole lot of themes there like that, but also you can see Esther herself is at the center of this. She's kind of the pivot point of the overturning. Now, is it God's overturning? It's not clear in this text, right? So anyway, there's lots more to say about kind of overturning and reversal that happens here. Reversal of fortunes, but also of kind of political realities. Okay, so there's another issue, and I'll move my face here. Another issue, by the way, this is Ellen Cavendish, is a local Atlanta artist, and this is a image that she made. It's called Esther Coming Out, and several authors, Tim Beale, graduate of Columbia Theological Seminary, who now is a professor at Case Western University in Old Testament, a really excellent Old Testament scholar. He talks about and writes about Esther as a coming out story, a story of hiding and revealing, which I think is really interesting. So here we have Ellen Cavendish's work of art where there's kind of a boundary here, right? And Esther is getting ready for the kind of pageant thing, and here she is coming out of her frame. And in terms of hiding and revealing, this is really important, I think, for two reasons. One is that Esther's very name, right? She's got two of them. One is Hadassah, which is her Jewish name. Esther is her kind of outward-facing name, which sounds a bit like Ishtar. Sounds like a Mesopotamian deity. So it's a way that she can kind of pass in society with this name that sounds like Ishtar. But if you know Hebrew, you know that Esther, the root there is satar, and there's an aleph prefix, Esther. An aleph prefix would mean a first-person future form, and the root satar means to hide. So Esther means I will be hidden. So her name itself is code for I will be hidden. Now, is that Esther or is that God who is hidden throughout this story, right? And people point to a couple of places in the story where God might really emerge as a character, especially in chapter 4. But if you read chapter 4, verse 13, that famous text, just read it carefully with me here. Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, "Do not think that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews." That is to say, if you try to hide and pass and you don't stand up and help your people, you're not going to, first of all, end up tricking everyone forever. Eventually they'll be outed as a Jew and then you'll have to suffer the consequences. But second of all, we deserve, right? You're part of our community. And you see this conflict happen sometimes where someone kind of makes it, and then there's the big question: are they going to reach back down and help the community from which they came from that was minoritized and in some way devalued in society, or are they going to kind of join the ranks of the elite now that they've made it, right? Esther's at this point where she's got to choose: is she going to risk everything to try to save her people, or is she going to try to cut ties, pass, and then save herself, right? And which and we're conditioned to say that's a terrible thing to do, but in that position, would you do it? I don't know. I don't know what I would do, actually. I hope I would do the right thing for the people that I care about, but at the same time, it's one of those situations you probably don't know what you do until you're in it. So Esther is confronted by this. What's she going to do? And then Mordecai says in verse 14, "For if you keep silence at such a time as this, relief and deliverance will rise to the Jews from another quarter, but you and your father's family will perish. Who knows? Perhaps you have come to the royal dignity for just such a time as this." And then, of course, Esther responds with this confidence and courage and says, "Okay, let's do it." But at the same time, we look at that and we say, well, that relief from another quarter, that means God. Well, it's not clear. Another quarter means another part of the city. It doesn't mean heaven. So basically Mordecai saying someone else is going to help us. It's either you is going to help us, or we're going to find somebody else, or another part of the empire. We're going to find help somewhere. It's not terribly clear it's God. And I think if we say, well, that's God, we take away a little bit of the mystery of the story, that I will be hidden, because maybe that's God who is hidden in this story. There's a theme I'll get back to later at the very end of this, but to say that over the course of Jewish history, there's this movement from a God who's very direct. Think about the Exodus story. God, throws lightning bolts from the sky, right? Is there scaring the Egyptians, throws them into the water, parts the waters, and so on. And then there's Esther, where God seems to be almost absent. there are other texts that we can almost date this way. The Joseph story. If you read the Joseph story and compare it to the Jacob story, remember God and Jacob are wrestling. They're touching each other. There's a physicality to it, a rawness to it. And then you read the Joseph story, and God's absent except for like dreams and some sort of divine intervention. And then this notion at the very end that it's all about providence, right? What you wanted to do for evil, God's going to use for good. It's kind of like a very remote God that works through providence in the long stretch of history. This is something that is very clearly a part of the theology of Judaism during the Persian period. So there's less of an emphasis on like a God that comes out of the skies that throws lightning bolts and is going to mix it up with people. There's more this sense of a God that is removed from the situation and works in hidden ways, in removed ways. So in any event, this kind of hiding and revealing, which sometimes we don't know exactly what's revealed, this is an important aspect of this. But we can also say that, of course, Esther ends up revealing who she is. She reveals who she is to the king at the right moment. So there's this theme that we can see in both Esther and Daniel 1-6, and that's this is a theme for a lesson for Jews living in diaspora, and that's choose your moment, right? Choose your moment to kind of wager, choose the right thing to wager on in terms of saying that no, you're not going to budge from this one situation, or choose the right things to not waver on, and choose the right things to just accept, but also choose the right moment to reveal something that you can keep hidden. There's not a lot of power that Daniel and Esther have in their situations, so whatever they have, they need to take very seriously in terms of power, and knowledge or information is one of them. So we'll come back to knowledge when we talk about Daniel, but here in Esther, this kind of information about who she is one of her kind of secret weapons. But then also we can say that there are other moments of kind of hiding and revealing. I mean, Vashti wants to be hidden. She wants to stay hidden, and the king tries to force her to reveal herself, but of course she ends up staying hidden in the end. There's a revealing of the kind of anxiety of the elite men in Persia about what happens if women decide to do something different than what the men want, and if they realize that the women actually have much more power than the men want the women to believe that they have. There's kind of this hiding and revealing of actual relations of power and the kind of intentions. So there are a lot of hidden intentions in the book. Mordecai and Haman's hidden intentions that are revealed in the end. The Esther's hidden intentions that get revealed at the right moments. The revelation of plans, like the plans that Haman has that get revealed, the truth that Mordecai saved the king, which gets revealed by this reading of the annals in the middle of the night, the truth of the kind of relationship between Haman and Mordecai in terms of who's supposed to be honored and who's not gets revealed in the end. So anyway, those are all hugely important, I think, topics about hiding, revealing, and I think the goal of it sometimes is that, like, at the end, to get us to imagine that God can be there with us, even in ways that God is hidden. I think that's even saying too much for the book. The book doesn't say that, right? But that's me kind of adding, in the context of a canon of biblical literature. I want to say that about Esther. A couple of things to note here is that there's a lot of overturning and hiding and revealing at the very end of the book that seems difficult for us to take, right? There's a lot of violence in the book of Esther. There's tremendous violence at the end, and it's often cut out of Christian lectionaries, which I get it. You don't want to read this stuff about the Jews enacting revenge upon other people, during the service or something like that. But at the same time, it's there. So in chapter 9, there's a plan to kill all Jews, right? There's a plan to eradicate Jews from the face of the earth. It's happened several times in history. This isn't the first or last time that plan was enacted. Remember, Haman is himself kind of a descendant of Agag, one of the first people to try to eradicate the Jews as a people, the Hebrews as they were wandering in the wilderness, the Amalekite, right? So under threat of annihilation, there's this kind of overturning or reversal or revealing, right, of a desire, and that's that the Jews get to gain power, and then they slaughter the people who are trying to slaughter them. This is, obviously it's ethically problematic, but what I want us to not do is just throw it out and ignore it, pretend it's not there in the Bible. It's there. The desire for violence is there. I want to say that if in the context of the genre of satire, if this is history, this is really problematic. If it's satire, It's still problematic, but it's problematic in a different way, and I think in a way that's much more understandable. It's allowing people to fantasize about rage, about what to do with rage. Like I said, this can be really dangerous in the hands of powerful people, but for people who are in diaspora to kind of like enact kind of this anger and rage through fantastical expressions of the desire for violence. I mean, it's real, it's human, and it doesn't necessarily lead to the kind of ethical outcomes we might imagine. I mean, this I don't think has led to mass slaughter in the same way that Christians who in positions of power have read Matthew when the Jews as a character in the book of Matthew say, "Let His blood be on us and on our children." That's been used to slaughter and attempt to eradicate the Jewish people throughout history. This has not led to similar uses of violence, but it's again in the context of Purim, of this kind of over-the-top, farcical, carnivalesque kind of releasing of emotions and desires and what you want. This kind of violent side to it, I think. This is real. It comes out. So all to say, this is also the part of the kind of the how Purim becomes a part of the Jewish tradition. So there's kind of an overturning or hiding or revealing of where this thing even comes from. Okay, so lots of things for us to think about there with Esther, and we'll end with that notion of violence. This is a medieval Jewish manuscript, an illuminated manuscript, where there's the slaughter of the children of Ahasuerus, the children of Haman, and a kind of a revenge and getting things, right? Getting plunder. But it's also really interesting to see that in chapter 9, verse 15, that the Jews did not touch the plunder. In verse 16, they laid no hands on the plunder. And then in verse 22, that there's this kind of presence of the poor and gifts to the poor. I mean, there's this notion that this was not done for communal gain or something like that. And in verse 9 of chapter 9 as well, they did not touch the plunder. So this is not ever supposed to be justification for taking things from people, but it's again this kind of expression of anger. Okay, so that's one kind of big topic for us to think about. In the comments, I'd like you to think about the bigger question of where is God in the book of Esther. I'm going to close this out with a short introduction to Daniel, but we're going to focus more on Daniel in the next section.